I have with me today Charmaine Wilkerson, who is the author of Black Cake. And I am going to start with a little bit of an introduction, but I'm very excited to have the chance to talk with her today about our BitchReads pick and really get into a great interview to have a conversation about this novel. So to start, Bitch Media's mission is to provide and encourage an engaged, thoughtful feminist response to mainstream media and popular culture. We are an independent, nonprofit feminist media outlet. You can find us in print with Bitch Magazine and online at bitchmedia.org. We are also home to the BitchReads program. Reading and books have been such an important part of our collective feminist education, and it was only natural to start the BitchReads Book Club as a way to gather our community. The BitchReads Book Club selects one recent new title curated by Bitch editorial staff to read together with our members, and we host a chat with our BitchReads author, who's here today, to provide our members with access to brilliant thinkers and exciting new voices. So whether you want to exclusive access to BitchReads authors or just want to support independent, reader-supported feminist media, please consider becoming a member of The Rage, which is Bitch's sustaining membership program. Now to our featured author, Charmaine Wilkerson, who is from New York, has lived in Jamaica and does much of her writing in Italy. A former news and communication professional, she has published award-winning stories in various anthologies and magazines. Her debut novel, Black Cake, is a New York Times bestseller and a Read with Jenna book club pick, as well as a BitchReads book club pick. And a screen series based on the novel is currently under development for Hulu. So I wanted to start with just the short snippet of this plot here for folks in our audience who haven't yet gotten the chance to read it. Byron and Benny haven't seen each other in years. Now these estranged siblings must set aside their differences to deal with their mother's hidden past. Theirs is a journey of discovery that takes them from the Caribbean to London to California and ends with her legendary Black Cake. This is a story of how the inheritance of betrayals, secrets, memories, and even names can shape relationships and history. So with that said, I want to first thank you so much, Charmaine, for your time today and for taking a second to sit with us and talk about Black Cake. I think my first question is really, if you could tell me a bit more about how you approached this book and what made you feel like it was the right time to pursue this story.
Well, thank you, Rosa, for inviting me. I love your idea, which you express, of gathering community, because books are just a great way to bring people together. I really should say something about my writing process to explain how I reached this point of writing this novel. I tend to write in short bursts, so I'll follow an idea. And I had a number of short scenes, and one of them focused on these teenage girls in the 1960s in the Caribbean who were obsessed with the sea. They were very strong swimmers, and they were destined to be a little different from what was expected of them as young ladies, in quotation marks, coming of age in the 1960s. And that story began to grow. But I also had other scenes which I thought might end up being short stories or nothing at all. At a certain point, I realized I had a whole novel going. So what was the undercurrent that sort of pulled all of this together? I tend to think a lot about identity, family, and shifting ideas of home, and how we inherit these ideas through stories, and how stories have the power to shape that. But also, food is a language which helps to transmit stories and ideas of identity. And a few years before I started writing this, a younger member of my family wrote to me to ask for my mother's legendary Black Cake recipe. And I was surprised that he would think about this. And the fact that I was thinking, this means something to him, I wrote some of that down, set that aside. I didn't know that I would write a story about cake. I didn't know that I would incorporate that. But as the other stories that I was writing started to grow, the Black Cake ended up in there, and I recognized that. So that's not necessarily a satisfying answer for you, Rosa, in that I didn't say today I'm going to write a story about Black cake and it's going to symbolize family togetherness, sisterhood, tradition, and also stories that are not always shared. I didn't sit down to do that. But when the Black cake showed up, I understood where I was going.
It became a bit of a connecting point there for some of the other stories that you were doing. Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about, going from flash fiction or short story writing to thinking more broadly and threading these stories together into a novel and something far more cohesive?
So I already mentioned this idea of writing in short bursts. I've always sort of done that since I've been writing fiction, which has been fairly recently in the past several years. But I discovered that other people were doing the same thing, only they were actually writing entire stories that would last maybe only 2 pages and sometimes 2 paragraphs. But these stories had beginnings, middles, ends, and entire worlds. So that helped me to cultivate this idea of short scenes. And that really, I think that helped to form the basis of this idea that I could tell a story with multiple voices, with a number of different scenes, and still somehow build an entire story. So the flash fiction sort of helped me to form that idea.
Right. And that's so present throughout. I mean, I think there are so many shifts in perspective, but they all do show so many other layers to the story, right? The overarching story, the sub stories within each of those chapters. And I think it's a really well put together piece, even though it feels like it can expand, it really does span so much time and so many different people. So I mean, I really enjoyed it for that alone, just because you can see those flashes and see those moments in time in a character's thinking or in what's happening to a character. Yeah, in our audience, we do have many emerging writers and folks who might also be considering writing their own novels. So I was curious if you had any advice for writers who were thinking about their first novel, or if there was any advice that helped you through this process.
Well, certainly each writer is different, and not everyone is going to do what I do, which is write these different scenes, put them in, Microsoft folders, and then say, there's a story, and start shuffling them. That's my idiosyncrasy, and it doesn't work for everyone. Others will want to sit down and say, I really want to explore family and identity, and here are some of the characters and ideas I have in mind. Many people start that way first, with a very clear idea immediately. What I would say, though, is not to be overwhelmed by the idea that you're writing a book with a capital B, or writing a memoir with a capital B. Do the writing, put it down. Yes, think about where you're going, do some mind mapping. I take a pencil and a piece of paper and I scribble, where am I going? How is this person connected to that? Is the connection between these two timelines clear? So to really whittle that down, I would say, write. Yes, think about what you're trying to say, but don't be overwhelmed by the idea of the final product. There's time to do the research and reach out, but one day at a time, one page at a time.
Right. No, that sounds very approachable. And I can definitely hear that. At least for myself, it would be a very difficult conversation to say, I'm going to write a book. But like you said, right, it is about taking it one page at a time, one paragraph at a time, one idea at a time, and seeing what comes from it. Yeah. And I think one of the things too that you've talked a bit about is this sense of identity and family that also is connected to place and to various places. And we've seen, within the novel, you travel from an island in the Caribbean and Italy and London and California, all of these different places. So I'm wondering if you could speak to the sense of place in the novel and, how those places do appear in the book and their centrality of them.
Yes, so when I think of place, this novel, as you know, is multi-generational, and it goes first from California to the Caribbean in the 1960s, and then to the UK in that same timeline, and back to the present day in the United States. But when writing about place, for example, I began with those girls in the 1960s, when I was starting to write. But the actual novel begins with Byron and Benny, a brother and sister born and raised in California. I tend to think more of the experience of the person in a place. So it could be a cold northern city. It could be the warm Caribbean Sea. It could be a surfable wave, the turbulent water. It could be a garden. So when I think of place, I'm thinking more of what is a person's experience in that environment? What does it feel like to be in that place? For me, it's not always about this city or that city. Now, in terms of this particular story, the logic of the imagination did have to go from the Caribbean to the UK to the US, because we're talking about an English-speaking island where people would naturally, if they moved, go to certain places. So some of that came to be.
Right. And, I know you spoke a little bit within our email interview around this sense of belonging and duality between these identities, and how folks might feel very much like their home is an island in the Caribbean and an island in Europe, right, the UK. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to that duality. Is that something that you are also familiar with, and how did that appear in the book?
Well, as you yourself mentioned, Rosa, I've lived in a number of places, and I was born to parents who were raised in the Caribbean, but were already of dual identity. And I won't go into that so much because that's about me, but I will say that the fact that I've moved around, the fact that I come from a multicultural family where across 2 or 3 generations, very few of us had the same upbringing or even really looked very much alike. These things have had me thinking about identity quite a bit. And I think that that is shows up in other stories I write. And it certainly was an undercurrent, the idea of dual identity. In the case of Byron and Benny, the brother and sister in the novel Black Cake, and their mother, Eleanor, to begin with, Eleanor has a dual identity on a simpler level. She's not who she said she was. Byron and Benny have dual identities in the sense that they identify equally as African American, but they look alike, but they're very different in terms of skin color. And so you run into issues of colorism, for example, between them. But also the idea of, who do you feel yourself to be? This is true of a number of characters in Black Cake. A number of characters feel quite strongly about who they are and who they're meant to be, but they're constantly running up against the expectations and stereotypes of other people. And in that case, the idea of dual identity calls into question how you, with your sense of who you are supposed to be, live in the world, because you don't live in a vacuum. No one lives in a vacuum. And so we're constantly juggling our ideas of self with other people's ideas of how we should live, what we should look like, whom we should love, what we should do for a living, where we should live.
Right, right. And there are so many of those examples within the story. I think so many characters really do struggle with the various levels of who they are externally and internally. And it can be very complex, but it's also such a rich way of thinking about identity. And I think that's something that really shines strongly through the book. I think, you talked about this too, in terms of starting with these 2 young girls in the Caribbean in the 60s. And one of the really big parts of the book that I've seen, throughout those generations is this real strength within the female friendships, and having these connections that are extremely, extremely deep, and, will help in covering who knows what has happened, possible murders, possible other situations that we see unfold. And I'm curious, if you could talk a little bit about writing those relationships and those friendships, and were there any inspirations for you that you looked at as you put those together?
I This is not an autobiographical story, and it's not even biographical, even though it uses a lot of details culturally from things that I could take from my own life. So I wouldn't say that any one relationship mirrors anything that I saw personally, but we steal details from all sorts of things we've seen and lived and heard and read. What I will say is this: we were talking about dual identity and the way in which you have an identity and how then in a way you live that identity differently because of what's happening around you. Well, we live our identities also based on our relationships. And I do feel strongly that love has a huge influence on our identities. We tend to think of love and attachment as having a huge influence on emotion, on the way we feel, but identity. And so in Black Cake, you certainly see, you mentioned the friendships, very strong friendships. You have romantic love, you have the sibling love, even though the siblings are struggling with their relationship. You have parent-child, but also love of self and love of the natural world. Especially for a few of the characters, the love of the natural world and that sense of connection helped to determine their sense of identity and how they wanted to live, and also created problems for them, but also helped them to overcome the changes in their lives. So in Black Cake, love is a kind of dimension of identity, and so is friendship. And but there are issues of loyalty and sometimes feelings of betrayal, as you know, as siblings grow apart, as parents don't quite live up to their children's expectations, and vice versa.
Right, right. And I think there is so much that is within those relationships that is, I think, very much about the ways in which the families, there are instances when one family member is keeping tabs on another family member, even though there's been a rift. And you don't know that this person is necessarily still aware of what is happening in your life, but there are people who are out there who are thinking about you, even if that relationship has been changed or things have shifted. And I found that to be such a powerful part of the novel, was the ways in which that love showed up, whether people were aware of it or not, or whether that love was explained or said more explicitly, or if it was acted upon in other ways. So yeah, I can see the ways in which that really emerged. And I think one thing that you also include here is such a strong sense of, there's such an immense history here, and each character does have such a sense of history, I think, in terms of trying to think about their past and those threads and how they're connected. And one thing that does, or one of the items that you see kind of throughout, are these keepsakes that the family can keep in certain ways and others will keep in different directions. And we kind of will sometimes learn the stories of those keepsakes, even without the family ever knowing, or the characters in the book ever knowing. So I'm just curious, how that came together. If you were thinking about these items, there's a measuring cup, there's a wooden box. What were some of your thinking just around those?
Yes, I love the power which everyday objects and small things have to transmit memory. And, after I'd already written this book, I read this amazing nonfiction book, which actually ended up winning the National Book Award. So you may be familiar with the title. It's called All That She Carried. It's about a cloth sack that was handed from an enslaved woman to her daughter. And All That She Carried was written by Tia Miles. And in that book, they talk about this idea too, that what if you have nothing left? Or, what carries memory? What carries nostalgia? And in the case of Black Cake, the mother actually ends up becoming a mother when she has just about nothing else left. So how does she transmit her family stories? Food is one way, but also we discover, as you mentioned, her daughter becomes very attached, for example, to this measuring cup, which they use to make the Black Cake. And it's a ritual kind of thing. This is not a thing of any objective value. It's even defective. but the connection, it's the story. So I think that objects also often are just language as the food. You know, it's a channel or it's a carrier for story, for memory, for tradition, for identity.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, many of us can imagine our own family keepsakes and different items that to others might not seem all that valuable, but to ourselves, in our families and our personal lives, we can understand where those connections are and why that value is there. So definitely understand that. But great. I think, oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to jump in?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, as you were saying, you can think of things in your own family as well, perhaps that don't have great external value or perceived external value on the outside, but that are special to you.
Right. Right. Well, thank you again so much. I think this has been such an illuminating conversation, and I've really enjoyed getting to learn more about you and about your process putting together this book. And again, for our audience, it's Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson, and we are really very grateful to you for taking the time to chat with us and answer some of our questions. Is there anything else you want to add before we run?
Well, thank you so much, Rosa, for giving me an opportunity to talk about Black Cake. It's I'm just thrilled that this multi-generational story is reaching readers, and I'm just so appreciative that people are sharing their own family stories with me through Instagram and Twitter and so forth. And it's great to meet you, and I look forward to seeing more of your other interviews.
Thank you. And I'm excited as well to see Black Cake in its potentially television form on Hulu. So that should be exciting as well for our readers to see.
Yes, I think that's going to be great. I'm really excited about the people involved in the project. Oprah Winfrey's production company, Marissa Jo Sarar. I think it'll be interesting.